Let's get something straight right now. An empath is not someone who is easy to fool. An empath is someone who often sees the truth early, but chooses patience over reaction. That is a very different thing. They notice the change in your tone. They catch the hesitation in your words. They feel the difference between what you say and what you mean. And here is where people make their first mistake. They assume that because the empath stays calm, the empath must not know. Wrong. What you are looking at is not ignorance. What you are looking at is restraint. That matters, because restraint is not weakness. Restraint is strength under control. It is the ability to understand someone's flaws without instantly punishing them for it. It is the discipline to give grace where other people would give anger. It is emotional intelligence in motion. But that grace has a limit, and the person who betrays an empath usually does not understand what really happened until it is too late. See, betrayal does something powerful to an empath. It forces a shift. Before betrayal, their energy is outward. They support, they encourage, they carry, they forgive. They try to understand your wounds, your stress, your inconsistency, your confusion. They make excuses for behavior that should have disqualified you. But after betrayal, that same emotional depth turns inward. And when that happens, everything changes. Now the empath studies the lesson. Now they connect every red flag they once tried to rationalize. Now they stop asking, how can I help this person? And start asking, why did I abandon myself to protect someone else from consequences? That question is life-changing. Because once an empath learns that lesson, they do not come back the same. This is what people regret forever. Not just losing access to a person. Losing access to a rare kind of presence. An empath is often the one person in the room who gave you understanding without requiring performance. They listened beneath your words. They saw the pain behind your ego. They gave loyalty before proof. They rooted for your healing while you were still making a mess of your life. That is uncommon. And common minds always underestimate uncommon value. So they betray it. They think they'll still be there. They think they care too much to leave. They think, I can cross the line and still keep the benefit. That is the delusion. Because the empath does not always explode. Sometimes they simply become clear. And clarity is terrifying to the person who benefited from their confusion. The day an empath becomes clear is the day your access starts closing. Not with drama, not with noise, not with endless speeches, with distance, with boundaries, with emotional detachment, with silence. And that silence hits harder than arguments ever could. Why? Because educationally, here is what is happening psychologically. When someone has been receiving emotional validation, patience, loyalty, and deep understanding from an empath, they become dependent on a source of stability they never fully appreciated. The moment that source is removed, they feel the absence of what they took for granted. That is regret. Regret is not always guilt. Sometimes regret is the sudden recognition of value after access is denied. And by then, the empath is no longer trying to prove anything. They are rebuilding. They are recentering. They are learning that compassion without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. They are discovering that being loving does not require being available to disrespect. They are understanding that forgiveness does not always mean reconnection. That is growth. And if you are the empath listening to this, hear me carefully. Your pain was not pointless. Your betrayal was not the end of your story. It was the end of your naivety. There is a difference. You did not lose because you loved deeply. You only suffered because you offered depth to someone committed to staying shallow. That is not your shame. That is your evidence. Evidence that you are capable of loyalty. Evidence that you are capable of patience. Evidence that you are capable of seeing humanity in people, even when they are disconnected from their own. Now the lesson is simple. Keep the empathy, lose the access. Keep the heart, sharpen the boundaries. Keep the compassion, upgrade the standards. That is evolution. You do not need to become cold. You need to become precise. You do not need to stop loving people. You need to stop auditioning for respect that should have been natural. You do not need revenge. Life handles that through contrast, because the person who betrayed you will eventually meet a world full of people who are less patient, less sincere, less loyal, and less real than you were. And in that moment, maybe months later, maybe years later, they will understand what they destroyed. Not because you told them, because reality taught them. That is why betrayal of an empath creates permanent regret. Not because the empath becomes cruel, but because the empath becomes unavailable. And once a genuine soul stops offering energy, the room changes, the relationship changes, the memory changes, the betrayer changes, usually too late. So stand up in your worth, stand up in your clarity, stand up in the knowledge that your empathy is not a liability, It is a gift that requires protection. Let this be your new rule. If someone confuses your kindness for weakness, let their consequences educate them. If someone mistakes your patience for permission, remove your presence. If someone betrays your heart, do not chase closure, choose elevation. Because the most powerful response of an empath is not destruction, it is transformation. And once you transform, the people who misused your goodness will remember you for the rest of their lives. Not because you threatened them, not because you fought them, but because they will never again find the exact combination of depth, grace, insight, and loyalty that they had in you. Betray an empath once, and the regret is not in what due to you. The regret is in realizing far too late that you lost someone who saw the best in you before you had the discipline to deserve it. An empath is often misunderstood because people confuse emotional depth with emotional weakness. But in reality, an empath is usually one of the most perceptive people in any room. Someone who reads tone, energy, inconsistency, hesitation, and hidden intent long before others notice anything is wrong. And that is exactly why betraying an empath becomes such a costly mistake. The reason is not magical, dramatic, or mysterious. It is psychological. An empath gives more than attention. They give emotional safety, patience, understanding, and the rare ability to see the humanity in someone even when that person is flawed, confused, guarded, or broken. They do not just hear words, they study patterns. They do not just react to behavior, they search for causes. Because of that, many people get comfortable receiving grace from an empath and begin assuming that such grace is unlimited. They think kindness means tolerance without consequence, forgiveness means access forever, and patience means they can cross the line repeatedly and still be welcomed back. That is where the regret begins. An empath usually does not leave at the first disappointment because they believe in growth, healing, context, and second chances, but once betrayal becomes undeniable, the lesson enters deeply and permanently. The empath starts connecting every ignored red flag, every rationalized excuse, every moment they abandoned their own intuition to preserve a relationship that was not being protected equally. And once that shift happens, something powerful changes. Their empathy does not disappear, but it becomes informed by truth. They stop pouring themselves into people who only value them when convenient. They stop trying to explain their worth to those who benefited from misunderstanding it. They stop confusing compassion with self-sacrifice. This is why betrayal of an empath creates long-term regret in the betrayer, because what is lost is not just a person, but a rare emotional environment. The betrayer eventually realizes that genuine understanding is uncommon, real loyalty is uncommon, sincere encouragement is uncommon, and being deeply seen without being immediately judged is even more uncommon. When an empath withdraws, the loss is felt in silence, not spectacle. There may be no revenge, no shouting, no dramatic ending, just a clean emotional exit built on clarity. And clarity is devastating to someone who relied on the empath's willingness to overlook what should have never been tolerated. Educationally speaking, this is a shift from emotional generosity to boundary-based intelligence. The empath learns that love without discernment invites disrespect, and that supporting someone should never require shrinking oneself. The betrayer, on the other hand, often learns too late that they had access to someone unusually patient, unusually intuitive, and unusually sincere. Later, when they encounter more transactional relationships, superficial loyalty, or people who mirror only their ego rather than their potential, they begin to understand what they destroyed. That is the real regret. Not punishment, but comparison. If you are the empath, the lesson is not to become cold, bitter, or closed off. The lesson is to remain kind but become precise, to remain caring but develop standards, to remain open-hearted but no longer available to deception. Betrayal is painful, but it can also become instruction. It teaches that your sensitivity is not a flaw, your depth is not a liability, and your ability to care deeply should never be handed to people who only know how to consume, manipulate, or take. The most powerful response is not revenge, it is evolution. It is becoming someone who still loves deeply but now chooses wisely, someone who still understands others but no longer ignores themselves, and someone who recognizes that once trust is broken, access to their heart is no longer a right. That is why betraying an empath once can lead to regret forever, because the person who was once willing to see the best in you will never again return in the same unguarded form, and few losses are heavier than realizing too late that you were trusted by someone rare and careless enough to waste it. People often misunderstand what an empath really is. They imagine someone overly emotional, easily hurt, too soft for a hard world, but that interpretation misses the deeper truth. An empath is usually not weak at all. An empath is highly aware. This is a person who notices the shift in voice before the words become dishonest, who senses distance before abandonment is spoken, and who can feel the difference between sincere connection and calculated convenience. That is why betrayal cuts so deeply. Not because the empath is blind, but because they often saw the warning signs and still chose to believe in the better side of someone. They give grace where others would give judgment. They offer patience where others would walk away. They try to understand the wound behind the behavior instead of reacting only to the behavior itself. In educational terms, this means an empath often operates with advanced emotional perception, strong pattern recognition, and high relational intelligence. They are reading what is said, what is unsaid, what is avoided, and what is emotionally leaking through the cracks. The tragedy is that many people misread this generosity. They assume that because the empath understands them, the empath can be taken for granted. They think kindness means unlimited tolerance, forgiveness means repeated access, and loyalty means no consequences. But betrayal transforms the empath in a way few people anticipate. It forces them to stop studying only the other person and begin studying themselves. They start asking difficult but life-changing questions. Why did I excuse what I clearly felt? Why did I protect someone else from accountability while abandoning my own peace? Why did I confuse compassion with obligation? That self-examination becomes a turning point. Once an empath truly understands that empathy without boundaries becomes self-betrayal, they change. Not always loudly, not always dramatically, but completely. Their heart may remain kind, but their standards become sharper. Their care may remain deep, but their access becomes earned. And that shift is what most betrayers never see coming, because they believed the empath would always be available in the same unguarded way. They did not realize they were dealing with someone whose silence, once awakened by truth, would become more powerful than any argument. The real regret comes later, because betrayal rarely feels expensive in the moment to the one doing it. At first, they may feel in control. They may assume they can explain it away, return when convenient, or continue receiving emotional support without ever honoring the trust that created it. But over time, reality begins to educate them. They start meeting people who are less patient, less sincere, less perceptive, and less invested in their growth. They begin to notice how rare it was to be understood without having to perform, to be encouraged without competition, and to be seen beyond ego, image, and surface behavior. That is when regret becomes permanent. It is not always dramatic guilt. Often it is painful recognition. It is the slow realization that they had access to someone rare and treated that rarity like something ordinary. When an empath leaves emotionally, they do not simply remove their presence. They remove a source of calm, validation, depth, and honest reflection. Educationally speaking, the betrayer loses an environment of emotional safety, and that loss is often felt only after comparison with lesser connections. Meanwhile, the empath grows. They learn that love is powerful, but love without discernment becomes dangerous. They learn that understanding others should never require the abandonment of self-respect. They learn that being compassionate does not mean remaining available to disrespect, manipulation, or repeated disappointment. Most importantly, they learn that forgiveness and reconnection are not the same thing. This is the lesson that turns pain into wisdom. If you are the empath, your mission is not to become cold. It is to become clear. Keep your depth, but protect it. Keep your kindness, but direct it wisely. Keep your emotional intelligence, but stop using it to justify what your spirit has already identified as harmful. Betrayal is not the end of your value. It is often the beginning of your precision. And if someone regrets losing you, let that regret teach them what your loyalty once tried to teach gently. That genuine people are not common, trust is not cheap, and the heart of an empath is not something to wound carelessly and expect to find unchanged later. An empath is often misunderstood because many people mistake emotional sensitivity for weakness, when in truth it is usually a refined form of awareness. An empath pays attention to subtle shifts in language, tone, behavior, and intention, often recognizing dishonesty or emotional distance long before others can name it. What makes betrayal so serious in this context is not that the empath was clueless, but that they often sensed the problem and still chose patience, grace, and understanding. They tend to believe that people can grow, that pain can explain poor behavior, and that compassion can heal what harshness cannot. This makes them generous in relationships, but it also makes them vulnerable to those who confuse kindness with permission. Educationally speaking, an empath often operates with high emotional intelligence, strong pattern recognition, and deep interpersonal sensitivity. They do not simply react to words, they interpret contradictions, emotional leakage, and repeated behavior over time. Because of this, when someone betrays an empath, the damage is larger than a simple broken promise. It shatters trust in a space where trust was not given casually, but built through deep observation, emotional investment, and sincere belief in another person's potential. The empath feels the betrayal not only as pain, but as evidence that their goodwill was mishandled. That realization becomes transformational, because it forces them to reevaluate not just the betrayer, but also the standards they used when deciding whom to trust. The real reason betrayal of an empath creates lasting regret is that people often do not understand the value of what they had until it is gone. An empath offers something rare: emotional presence, patience during weakness, encouragement without hidden competition, and the ability to see a person beneath their image, pride, or confusion. Many people receive that support and begin to assume it is normal, replaceable, or endlessly available. They start thinking the empath will always understand, always forgive, and always remain open, no matter how many times the line is crossed. This is a major psychological miscalculation. An empath may forgive internally, but once they fully accept that betrayal was intentional, repeated, or carelessly dismissed, they begin to withdraw with clarity. This withdrawal is not always loud or dramatic. In many cases, it is quiet, deliberate, and final. The empath stops explaining, stops overextending, and stops giving emotional access to someone who treated loyalty as something cheap. For the betrayer, regret usually begins later, when comparison teaches what appreciation did not. They encounter people who are more superficial, less patient, less loyal, and less invested in truth. They begin to recognize how uncommon it was to be deeply understood without being instantly judged. In educational terms, they lose a relationship dynamic built on emotional safety and genuine insight, and that absence becomes the lesson. Regret is born when someone realizes they were trusted by a rare soul and responded with carelessness, manipulation, or disloyalty. By the time that lesson becomes clear, the empath is often no longer emotionally available in the same way. For the empath, however, betrayal does not have to become bitterness. It can become refinement. The goal is not to stop caring, but to care with wisdom. The lesson is not that empathy is dangerous, but that empathy without boundaries can become self-betrayal. This is where growth becomes powerful. The empath begins to understand that compassion does not require tolerating disrespect, and forgiveness does not require restoring access. They learn that being loving is not the same as being endlessly available, and that emotional depth should be protected, not handed out to those who repeatedly prove they cannot value it. This creates a stronger version of the empath, one who still possesses warmth and understanding, but now pairs those qualities with discernment, standards, and self-respect. They no longer ignore their intuition in order to preserve a connection. They no longer turn red flags into rescue missions. They no longer confuse someone's pain with their right to wound others. In this way, betrayal becomes instruction. It teaches the empath to remain kind without becoming naive, to remain open without becoming unguarded, and to remain compassionate without abandoning themselves. That is why the regret on the other side can last so long. The betrayer eventually understands that they did not merely lose someone caring, they lost someone rare, perceptive, and deeply sincere. And once that kind of person learns the cost of misplaced loyalty, they may still wish others well, but they rarely return with the same unrestricted trust again. An empath is often misunderstood because many people confuse emotional sensitivity with weakness, when in reality it is usually a form of advanced human awareness. An empath tends to notice changes in tone, energy, language, and behavior much earlier than most people do. They can often sense discomfort behind a smile, dishonesty behind polite words, or distance behind artificial affection. This does not make them fragile, it makes them perceptive. In an educational sense, an empath often demonstrates high emotional intelligence, strong pattern recognition, and an unusual ability to interpret both verbal and nonverbal communication. That is why betrayal affects them so deeply. It is not simply that they were hurt, it is that they usually gave trust after carefully observing someone, understanding their struggles, and choosing compassion anyway. They often do not invest in people casually. They invest with intention, depth, and emotional sincerity. When such trust is broken, the injury reaches beyond disappointment and enters the level of identity, boundaries, and belief in the relationship itself, What makes betrayal of an empath especially serious is that the empath often gives what many people rarely receive elsewhere: emotional safety. They listen without immediate judgment, support without demanding constant reward, and often try to understand the pain behind someone's harmful behavior. In many cases, they offer multiple chances because they believe people can improve. This is where others make a dangerous mistake. They begin to assume that understanding means permission, that patience means tolerance without limit, and that forgiveness means permanent access. They underestimate the value of someone who consistently sees the best in them. Educationally, this reflects a common human error called value blindness, where people fail to appreciate a resource while it is present, because it feels familiar and available. The empath becomes emotionally reliable, and because of that reliability, they are often taken for granted. But the same person who once gave grace can become distant once betrayal becomes clear. Not because they suddenly stop caring, but because they finally understand that repeated betrayal is not confusion, it is information. It reveals character, priorities, and the limits of the other person's integrity. The turning point for an empath usually begins when pain becomes clarity. After betrayal, they begin reviewing patterns they once ignored, excuses they once defended, and intuitions they once silenced in order to preserve connection. This self-reflection becomes educational and transformative. They start to realize that empathy without boundaries becomes self-neglect, and compassion without discernment can attract people who consume rather than reciprocate. That lesson changes them. Their empathy does not disappear, but it becomes wiser. Their kindness remains, but their access becomes restricted. They no longer explain themselves endlessly to people who benefited from misunderstanding them. They no longer offer emotional closeness to those who confused loyalty with weakness. This is why regret often follows the betrayer later. At first, the betrayer may not feel the loss fully because they assume the empath will remain available. But once the empath emotionally withdraws, the absence becomes visible. The betrayer begins to notice that true patience is rare, real understanding is rare, and unconditional emotional support is far more uncommon than they believed. What they lost was not just a relationship, but a rare form of human presence. For the empath, the final lesson is not to become cold, suspicious, or bitter. It is to become accurate. The goal is not to stop loving people, but to stop offering deep loyalty where there is no deep responsibility. Betrayal can become a painful but powerful teacher. It teaches that being kind does not require being unprotected, that forgiveness does not always require reconnection, and that self-respect must exist alongside compassion. In educational terms, healthy empathy is not endless emotional availability. It is the balanced ability to care while maintaining clear standards. This is why betraying an empath once can lead to regret that lasts for years. The betrayer eventually understands, often too late, that they were trusted by someone rare, someone who saw beyond appearances and still chose to care. Once that kind of person learns the cost of misplaced trust, they may still wish others well, but they rarely return in the same open-hearted form. The regret, then, is not created by revenge. It is created by realization. The realization that genuine people are uncommon, trust is valuable, and a deeply empathetic heart should never be handled carelessly.